That's not far from where I worked one summer, on the roof of the Parliament buildings.
Okay, Jim, we're live, so we're starting. Dr. Jim
Okay.
Shalom. Dr. Jim Shalom, welcome to You've Got Mel.
Thank you.
Okay, come close.
I think before.
Yes, we have met. And you'll have to be near the microphone so people can hear you.
Okay.
So how
is that better?
It's better. I must say that all the people I've interviewed, about 30, there has never been such excitement as there is today. All kinds of people that we grew up with are very excited to see you. And of course, I am too. So why don't you start at the very beginning? Your name, where you come from, your folks. Shoot.
Okay, well, I'll start. I'll do it briefly, and you can direct me if you want more depth or not. So I grew up in Ottawa like you did. And I went to a parochial Jewish school where I received a good background in Judaism and a religious education. Went to study at high school. I studied at one of the prestigious high schools in Ottawa, although I studied there just because it was in Lisgar Collegiate. It was one of the older ones too. And I took a special science course, an experimental science course there. And from there, it reinforced my interest in chemistry. I then went to the Hebrew University and ended up doing my undergraduate degree in chemistry with you and biochemistry. I have a double major. And then living in Israel, I had to vision about long-term plans, and I intended to live in Israel. I had to do my army service. So I served 2.5 years as a paramedic in the paratroopers. It's a volunteer unit. And while I was a paratrooper, it confirmed my interest in medicine. It took me a year to get in, but in the end, I transferred to London, Ontario, and did my degree and my MD at the University of Ontario, and my specialty in family medicine. And it turned out to be much that my program director was well known and had an international name, including in Israel. So when I returned to Israel as a special family doctor, everybody knew who my director was. His textbook was one of the ones which was used by the various family medical departments in Israel. And nevertheless, Israel has its bureaucracy. I had to repeat my specialty, part of my specialty rotations and my specialty exams. One had nothing to do with the other. And since then, I've been basically practicing medicine in Israel, while occasionally back to Canada to do what they call locums. That would covering other doctors who go on vacation, keeping my Canadian license, etc. Along the way, I met Orly. We married, and we have 2 children, one of whom is in Vancouver right now, and one is in lockdown in where we live in the Western Galilee, working from home because of the COVID-19 crisis. I guess in a nutshell.
Okay, so let's start with some of the softer stuff. You were born in Ottawa, and your name is not really Jim Shalom originally, is it?
Well, sort of. Our family name has a history, and it's like a puzzle with some pieces missing. First, I'm a Kohen, and most Jewish people who belong to that category have a name like cats, and I don't. My name actually sounds Sephardi, but it's Ashkenazi. My father's name, my father who came from Belarus, from Gomel, which is now in the news, his name was actually Shalom Yenik, which sounds very much Russian, but could be Hebrew. Yenik is a mammal, so somebody along the way may have changed the name to one who suckles peace. So we actually don't know the entire story of our family name. But with a name like Jim Shalom, I didn't have to tell anybody in Canada that it was pretty self-evident.
Okay. I at the beginning when we were 3 years old, I didn't know you as Jim. Everybody called you what?
Well, I don't want to go into the nicknames that I used at that time. Okay. I have 2 English names and 2 Hebrew names, and my nickname was based on one of my Hebrew names. For at least 60 years hasn't been used. Let's leave it at that.
Okay. And your 2 English names.
My 2 English names are Eric James, which is also a problem because in situations such as the Army, they formally and automatically go by my first name. Whenever I'm called, and Eric in Hebrew is Arik, like Arik Sharon. So whenever I'm called Arik, I know it's probably somebody from the Army who is talking with me. But I go by my middle name, Jim.
Okay, but in your passport, it's still Eric James Shalom?
That is correct.
But we lost you, Jim.
My passport is Eric James Shalom.
To this very day.
To this very day. I haven't changed that.
That's amazing. But nobody ever called you Eric. We called you Jimmy in school.
Right. But here and there, again, people who identify me by my identity number, etc. Eric. I had an interesting religious experience a few years ago when a person asked me what my name was. And I said, Jim. And then he said, but when they go up to the Torah, what name do they use? And then I used my Hebrew name, and I'm named after my grandfather, my father's father in Hebrew. So I have 4 names, actually, almost like Prince Charles. So I have but I mostly use my name, Jim.
Okay, and who decided not to call you Eric?
I don't know. I think it was probably me. I have no idea.
Okay, and so I'm not going to out you to your...
I know you're jealous because I know that you're jealous because you only have 1 name.
That's correct. So you could have lent me at least one name.
Yeah, but
that's water
that's
on.
How some of us get more, some of us get less.
Okay, but
when we were thinking of naming our children, and I discussed it with my wife about giving 2 names, she said, "Why 2 names? And why not? It doesn't take up any space." And
Jim, you're frozen for a minute. So I'll just tell the audience until you come back to us, hopefully soon, that you didn't lend me any of your names, but you did lend me your parents. So I hope you're listening. I kind of grew up in your house, at least during the weekend. Jim, this is time to leave and come back in because I don't see you. Do you hear me?
if you want to disconnect, can you hear me or not?
Now we can hear you. So I said that can you hear me now? Jim?
Just a moment.
Okay.
How is that now?
Now it's much better. So I was telling our international audience that you never lent me one of your 5 names, for which I am eternally jealous, but you did lend me your parents.
Right.
So so a few words about your marvelous parents, Dina and Israel.
Wow. Okay, that goes back a long way. My father was born in Laos, and he emigrated to Ottawa with his mother. It was a second marriage for her. and he had several half siblings that he was in contact with until the end of the Second World War, and then lost contact with. And we were sort of silly kids, and we never really asked him about it. Many years later, in the last year of his life, when he was living with us in Israel, and we had to get somebody to help take care of him, we brought a woman who could speak Jewish and could speak a little English by the name of Chasia. And suddenly my father said that he had once had a sister named, and they developed a special rapport. But basically, my father came to Canada as an immigrant, worked hard, had very little schooling, worked hard, and built himself up as a businessman. I come from very Zionistic families, and he met my mother in a Zionistic group. My mother was born in Winnipeg. Her parents came from the Ukraine, and and she came east because there was no work there. And she met my father, and both my parents were very hardworking, family oriented, not ostentatious, good citizens, active in the Jewish community, spent a lot of time doing volunteer work. My father would canvass for Jewish causes. His organization used to put out what they called an Ottawa Jewish phone book, and they would advertise. It was a source of income. It was also used for fundraising. The 7 or 10 men, there weren't many, would devote to pages, and each of them was given, say, 5 pages to go through. And in the evening, after a long day's work, my father would sit and call one after another, soliciting loans. And when people would say, not now, call me in a week, or I don't have money now, or whatever, he would write it down, and he would follow it up a week later. And they managed to raise a lot of money for Jewish causes, for Jewish education field, for people in need. It was really quite impressive. He wanted something important. My mother was a silent socialist. She used to canvass for the NDP, and both my parents would drive people to the hospital and do all sorts of community work, even though both of them worked very hard. My mother, for a while, used to teach retarded children. She had a friend who had a daughter who was retarded, and there was really no proper educational framework. So she began to work as a teacher for retarded children. I used to say my mother was a retarded school teacher. It was very challenging in those days, especially in Canada, because of getting the kids out for breaks in the winter. They had to be dressed up and undressed. It required enormous patience, maybe 3 months to a child to tie his shoelaces. And I learned success isn't necessarily something very high. It's really context relevant. And one of the, I think you probably, one of the bowling alleys in Ottawa used to let the children bowl for Sunday mornings. So I used to go and keep score for them. I think you joined me a few times.
That's
and
true.
That
and I learned a lot from that, Jim.
One thing about the children and just getting a perspective, the school had children who spoke in English, and all the French children, all the retarded French children spoke English, whereas myself, whose intelligence was okay, struggled with French. I had to have them speak to me in French. It was certainly a lesson in humility.
Yes, this was when I went with you there. I remember it was a huge lesson for me in humanism. And
I can remember. I can remember one child being intimidated by the ball. So another retarded children very sensitively, very compassionately help them go through the motions of picking up the ball and throwing it down the lane. It was certainly a lesson.
So Jim, you grew up in a kind of a castle. As a young
What do you mean?
as a young boy, you grew up in this mansion with a with interesting rooms and corridors and back
Okay.
stairs leading up to different apartments, and there was different doors and a
Yeah.
basement. And
I don't know if you know the background. Our house was actually it was in Ottawa, the capital city. So our house was an embassy. And when my father bought it, he converted it to an apartment building. And we lived on floor and in the basement. And the upper 2 floors were rented out. There were 4 apartments. And we had, for a while, my grandmother lived in one of them. And we had 2 tenants long for years, both of them single moms with single daughters and part of a family. And to this day, I'm still in touch with one of them on a regular basis and the other one periodically.
wow.
It's really quite interesting. What was another factor was that we lived in sort of, as you know, in the old Centertown area, which was everything. And from my parents' point of view, anybody who was a friend of any of us could drop into our house at time. And you were one of the maybe dozens of people who used to use our house. And the word got out that if there's a problem when you're downtown, just Shalom's and you can come in. We never locked our door. We never locked our car. Those were different days than today.
Yes, I remember. I remember your place was like a caravanserai. There were always people coming and going. I was thinking about it this morning. There was a refugee, a Jewish refugee who had fled Hungary in 1955. I don't know whether you remember.
He lived with us for a while. Yes. He became a Canadian physician. He lived with us for a while. And yes, and there were others too that used our place. Sure. Yeah.
And I used to camp out on weekends for many years.
Yeah, that was obvious. Yeah.
So
and I never, parents had this attitude that the house wasn't theirs, it was ours. And they did the same sort of gap in generations, so that when my friends came over, they were welcomed. And when we had our Jewish movement meetings, and after the meeting, which was nearby, I used to invite people to our place. Both my parents were home. And a lot of the kids who were adolescents at the time and were going through that rough period with their parents would often go to one of my parents and just talk with them. And my parents were very accepting, just blended in. It was really almost incongruous, but that was the way things were.
Absolutely. And let's go back to your childhood that I remember very well. How would you characterize yourself? What was your biggest advantage as a kid growing up? Or your strongest characteristic, or do you want me to tell you?
You can tell me. I always felt that my parents trusted me and had faith in me and supported me in doing what I determined was important, even though they were very opinionated. And it gave me a sort of confidence, especially when I was an adolescent and starting to do things which could be perceived as reckless. They trusted me with the car. They trusted us. I think we went once to Montreal on our own. Those were the days when there weren't phones or whatever. And they sort of, without saying, expected me to behave responsibly. And without being ordered to do so, I did. And I think it allowed me to cut my own path in life and to pursue what was important to me. I think that's if I had to say it, that's sort of how I would describe it.
You mentioned this seminal trip that we took together. We actually hitchhiked to Montreal.
Right.
I was 14 or 15, you're half a year older. And we hitched a lift halfway to Montreal with a guy who was driving erratically and told us that his mother just died. I don't know if you remember, that.
I think you remember, yeah.
But so I think, like if you ask the kids that grew up with us in Ottawa, they would say that your strongest point was determination. You were not the biggest kid in the class, but when we played football, if you had the ball, you were impossible to stop. I remember this about you. You were an unstoppable character. When you believed in something, your determination was incredible. That's one thing.
Well, it helps. It helps you get through the tough periods in life, and there are many.
Yes, I always looked up to you in that respect. And I guess the second, there's maybe three things I would talk about. The second one is loyalty. You were an extremely loyal friend, a very competitive friend. We collected coins. If I had coins from 40 countries, you'd get coins from another 10 countries, and then you had coins from 44 countries. If I invited somebody on a date, you had already dated her. We had this competitive childhood, but at the same time, you were the most loyal of friends and human beings. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that you're a person who sets huge goals for themselves. I remember, people sometimes fast on Tisha B'Av in August for 24 hours, religious people, and you once fasted for 48 hours. I don't know whether you remember that.
I remember. I wanted to see how long I could fast. I think it was 36 hours.
And then in Israel, when you went to the army, you volunteered for the paratroopers, an elite unit. You served 2.5 years. You did reserve duty. You are a person who has endless goals that you are able to test yourself and come through on.
Well, I don't know if I describe it in such Hollywood type terms.
That's why you've got Mel.
Okay, I think the association that I have now is with people with illness. I'm a physician after all, and most of my work now is directed towards end-of-life care. And I think that the people who cope most effectively with the adversities of life, such as an illness, are those people who have an internal compass. In other words, they try to figure out what's important for them and how to take it on. So a person who has to deal with an illness has got to confront the illness in almost a philosophical way. Do they look upon it as a punishment? Do they look upon it as a burden? Do they look upon it as something, whatever? And if they can internalize dealing with the illness, then they can set out their goals. Well, how would I like to illness? And how is it going to interfere with my life? And what about my family, etc. And I think that from a young age, I had the internal compass, which meant that whatever resources I had, I could direct in a very focused way on what was important to me at the time. And that hasn't changed. My goals have changed, but that approach hasn't changed. And others will interpret that as determination, but it's just concentrating your energy. It's sort of like using a magnifying glass with sun. It's concentrating all your resources into what you determine is most important to you, and setting up or looking for a goal which is enough for you, but which is attainable or almost attainable, in pursuing it. It's actually a very simple formula. It's just challenging at times to apply it.
Yeah, but Jim, everybody's saying, I'm fasting and I can't wait till evening comes, to have a really great meal. And you say, well, okay, I'll fast another. I remember when we walked for Oxfam, right? And
The
my
40
feet,
kilo, the 40
yeah,
kilometers.
40 kilometers. And, my feet gave
Right.
out at 20. And you walked until your flesh came off. This is the way that I remember you as a kid.
Well, yeah, I hadn't trained properly for it, and I wasn't used to walking that. But as long as nothing stopped me, there was no reason.
Okay, you're breaking up a bit.
It seems pretty simple. Okay, can you hear me now?
I hear you now. So Jim,
Yeah.
about 10 years ago, you won a prize, and I traveled to Jerusalem to be one of your admiring audience. What was this award for?
Okay, it was a sweet award. I guess over 20 years ago, I came in contact. Maybe I can go back 2 steps. When I trained as a family physician in small town Ontario, those were the days when the family doctor did everything, literally everything. You followed women when they were pregnant. You gave them birth control. They became pregnant. You followed them when they were pregnant. You delivered their babies, and then you took care of their babies, and etc. And as part of that work, we also took care of people who were dying. In other words, when people were very ill, you sent them to the hospital, and then you ran to the hospital to take care of them. So, and Canadians, I mean, I'm generalizing, and each person is different, but they in those days, if the doctor said that's all we can do, they usually accepted it, especially from the family doctor with whom they invested a lot of trust. So as part of my training, I had experience with dealing with people at the end of life. And I could realize them, I could take care of them at home, etc. And I only saw it as a part of my general work as a physician. At some stage in Israel, I came in contact with a woman by the name of Nancy Caroline, who was interested in setting up a home hospice. In other words, there weren't hospice type services. The concept of hospice care was really foreign in Israel. And she needed my help because I was a fairly high ranking medical administrator to get our health fund to sign on to them. So I signed on. So I was able to help her, and she asked me to be on the board of directors. And for several years, I was fairly passive, where I would just sort of attend meetings and go over the book reports, etc., but not very active. At a certain point, she took ill, and she became very ill. And at some point, she asked me to take over running the hospice. And it was very complicated because the hospice geographically was in one direction and my other work was in another direction. And I really couldn't stop my other work. In the end, I agreed to do it. And I worked very, very hard at promoting the hospice. It was a volunteer organization, so there was a lot of fundraising involved. We were probably providing, if not the best care, as good care as possible on international standards. We also won international awards. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes which had to be done. And we expanded not just into the medical field and the nurse field, but we had, I sort of believed that a person's audit at the end of their life isn't primarily medical. They need the medical care. So we had an art therapist, and we had a thanatologist, a woman who played the harp. We expanded into some of the paramedical fields to make this last passage in people's lives and their families a bit easier. And we really built, Nancy had got it well established, but it really needed somebody sort of more familiar with how things work in Israel to get it running on a much higher scale. There's an expression in Hebrew that a prophet isn't identified in his own village. Ein navi be'iro. I think I was accepted, but not much more than that. At a certain point, and in the meantime, you meet fantastic people who are doing parallel projects of helping people who are ill or helping people with psychiatric problems or whatever. And just because of my position of power and resources, etc., I didn't hesitate to help other people. We were all even though I was getting a salary, it was mostly volunteer work, and I met other people of like, and I helped them out too. Several different organizations when I believed that what they were doing was important, and when I felt I could. At a certain point, a crisis developed within our own hospice, and I left under very unpleasant circumstances, and I accepted that as that's how fate is. I wasn't the first person, and I was grateful that I had other work and that I wasn't ill, etc. Just sort of an ego type of problem. I felt sorry for Nancy that I couldn't continue to promote her cause. I'd had a great deal of respect for her. By then she had died, but that was the way it is. Well, one of the administrators of one of the other organizations called me one day and said, I want our organization to give you an award for your work. I said, what work? I've hardly done anything for your organization. Here and there I've helped. But he insisted. And so they organized an evening, and there were several people that they honored, and I was one of them. And you were one of the guests. And that's sort of the story of that. That was a good feeling. I felt that just my immediate family was there, and you were there, and my friends. There weren't many people that I brought there. I felt that I was continuing the tradition of my parents. Maybe I had more professional skills, but basically I was doing the same thing that they had done years ago. And just as they did it, not expecting accolades, I basically continued in that same sort of spirit and did it the same. So that's the story there.
I guess that brings us to the following question. I posted this morning a picture of us. I think it's my third birthday. I guess if I was 3, you were 3.5. You have this very pensive look on your face.
We go back a long way.
Yes, and we're not spring chickens. When you look back at your life, and you did take many decisions, decision of living in Israel, not Canada, the unexpected decision for me of becoming a physician, because you did study political science.
I actually apparently knew that I wanted to be a physician. Although I didn't realize, when I was a young child, when people used to ask me what I want to be when I grow up, I used to say, a doctor, daddy, Indian. Well, I never became an Indian, but I became a physician. But sure, as an adolescent, I wasn't thinking. We had no contact with physicians. My parents weren't professional. My parents were blue collar. We were rarely ill, and when we were ill, we already called the doctor, except for this Hungarian refugee occasionally. We never had an issue when we were ill at home, so that was really not part of my home repertoire. But I came around to it later. I realized it came from something inside me. I just knew I had to be a physician.
Amazing. So and one thing, you said that you delivered babies?
Of course.
I never knew that about you.
I have a story. Yes, sure. I delivered babies. One day, about 10 years ago, I was back in Canada. I was doing locum work. I was in the hospital, and I was working with a nurse, and she took me aside and she said, do you know that you delivered my son? And I said, how old is he now? And she said, 14 or whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, I want to tell you something. It's not like how it works in Israel, because the babies you delivered, you knew the family. You knew the parents, often you knew the grandparents, and you took care of the baby. And you weren't a professional obstetrician. Um, and during the antenatal course, as long as they weren't complicated pregnancies, you knew what sort of expectations the woman had. She knew what she was getting into, um, and so we did it. I can tell you two funny stories about that. Although one of them was a colleague physician of mine asked me to cross cover for her while she went on vacation. And she said that, don't worry, none of my pregnant ladies are due. And of course, one lady became due and I had to rush off to the hospital to deliver the baby. And that worked out all well. And another time I came in early labor. And to my distress, it turned out to be a breech delivery.
Right.
Now I knew how to do breech. That's with the bum first. They're complicated, potentially dangerous. Nowadays, if the doctor knows it's a breech, they won't even allow a natural delivery. They'll do a C-section. And the bum there, and I said, should I deliver? Should I not? And I said, I'll wait. As long as the umbilical cord isn't out, and the baby's heartbeat will rush to do things, although you're so tempted to sort of get started. And I put in a phone call for one of the senior physicians in the area. We all cross-covered for one another. And in the meantime, went into the textbooks and I read again and again, what are the stages of doing a breech delivery? Now, the doctor who helped me out is a real character. He wouldn't come to the hospital without putting on a tie and a shirt. He had to get dressed up properly. Even though he took it all off when he got there. He was one of these characters, but he was really, really the version of the old family doctor who had done everything, could do everything. And he just like a cast on better than a lot of orthopedic surgeons, he could do a delivery better. And I knew I had to wait for him. So I was sweating a lot. The baby was fine. We waited for him to come and then we did the delivery and everything worked out okay.
Amazing.
It's not how it's done these days, but in those days it was like that. And so I used to really, really look forward to the deliveries, although now I bite of complications, but that was part and parcel of our treatment then.
So Jim, two things we're running out of time. So we've lived quite a life. When you look back, do you regret things? Are you kind of a person who said, maybe I shouldn't have come to Israel in the first place, maybe I shouldn't have done that? Or are you forward-looking?
First of all,
and the reason I'm asking is because during this period of COVID, you're sending me some stuff, that you've had for over 50 years, all kinds of documents, letters, invitations, newsletters, bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
What are you keeping all this?
Okay, well, I think maybe I can give an answer which incorporates it all. Right. First of all, like you, I'm over 65 or over 67, so I'm of retirement age. I'm grateful. I feel grateful that I'm retiring at this age and maybe not 30 years ago. I think for retirees who are relatively healthy and not poor, it's an opportunity to enjoy life. I think we're approaching 70. I think our 70 is years ago, and opportunities are there. And one of my goals even though I'm working almost full time, but it's I have nowhere near the pressure that I had before. I think that this is a time in life when one can plan. Now you can plan things when you're younger, but you've got financial pressures, family pressures, professional development pressures. A lot of that stuff just dissipates as you get older. And part of the game of retirement for me is setting up a goal, seeing if I can implement it, and then comparing what it looks like after I've gotten through to how it was in the beginning. And one of the goals, this sounds very mundane, but I'm a pack rack. I throw nothing out, and I have boxes and boxes and boxes of papers, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I decided that I would get a proper scanner and a shredder and programs in my computers that it would be quite easy to retrieve information. And I've started going through it. And it's previous memories. And it allows me without, in other words, the paper goes into the shredder. And in that respect, I symbolically come to terms with the fact that an event or a person or something is no longer there. But actually, I have the PDF version so that I can sort of go back and experience it again. By the way, it's a remarkable experience. I have some correspondence around events of 30 and 40 years ago where several people, this physician that I worked with in Canada, when he died, I was no longer there. But I was in touch with many people and they were writing me about what happened. And I almost felt like calling up and saying, "Hi, May, how are you and how are you managing with this?" The only thing is that was 30 years ago and May is no longer alive, sort of minor problems here. I think in looking back, most of the time, the decisions that I made are one which met the expectation. So for example, to Israel, financially as a doctor, there's no doubt I would do a lot better in Canada and it would be a lot easier and I would a lot more affluent. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But I realized that when I decided to come here as a physician. So there's really nothing new or disappointing about that. May have hoped to make more. On the other hand, my work as a physician in Israel has been far more diversified and stimulating than it could have been in Canada and maybe relevant for me. So sort of working with immigrants in Chatzor who are
Jim.
barely literate and teaching them sort of how to take care of themselves. Yes, working with people who were just coming into the modern age and didn't know how to handle complex problems, but put their complete faith in the physician was an opportunity for me. I worked with a very Jewish Haredi community where I knew that they would consult with the physician, with the rabbi about any important decision, but I know something about their families. And if with their first child, I helped them manage to learn how to deal with fever and sort of childhood illnesses, if not by the second, by the third child, they rarely called me. And when they called me, it was only because it was a very important reason. Working with Holocaust survivors and their families was satisfying for me. I was involved in an economic project where I think as a consequence of it, the level of care and compliance in the Arab communities, which until then, the level of medicine was much lower, within 10 years equaled the level of care and the quality of service in the Jewish communities. These are all factors which maybe I didn't know about them in advance, but I poured sort of more than just renewing somebody's hypertensive medication in Canada. So these decisions, by and large, the results all met my expectations. And I think that's what's important. Everything is a package. When you do something, you're not doing something else. I think you went through many of the same things yourself too.
Yeah, but I'm interviewing you today.
Okay. But, when you
yeah.
decided to pursue, okay, go ahead.
Today is about you, Jim. So, Judy Collins, whom we loved as kids,
right,
she wrote to my class a few years ago about life. And she said,
Uh-huh.
look back on your life, but don't stare. And
Right.
I think that this is the trick. And I love your analogy about planting. And I'll just say that when we talked a few days ago, you surprised me because, you know, we're closer to 70. And, you know, I'm very careful when I go out, and you're still running around being a physician and treating people. And you're still the same little Jimmy pushing back, right? Challenging yourself, not giving in. And I think that's remarkable. And it's I just hope that you'll take good care of yourself while you're doing this. But like you, there's a value in never retiring and in always feeling that you can plant something. And I just finished with Yechiel Eckstein, Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, our friend whom we grew up with, who died suddenly last year. And he, when we went to the Shiva, um, when you come into the house, there's this Japanese picture of peaks, mountains, and then a higher mountain, and then a higher mountain. And somebody in Yechiel's family, I think one of his kids said that Yechiel bought that picture because it reminded him that every time you climb a mountain, you have to look at the next peak that you're going to climb. Comment.
Um, I think it goes to what's his first name, Frankl, who was a psychiatrist who went through the Holocaust, tried to figure out why some people lived through the camps, even though they were often in poor state, and why other people relatively healthier didn't manage. And he said that the ones who survived were the ones who had purpose and significance in life. And I think retirement is about taking things easier and slowing down and realizing your limitations, but not losing sight of what's important. So if we take this COVID-19 period, there are people whom I have a friend who are dealing with people who are ill with the virus. Well, that's something I wouldn't do today. That's dangerous, and I think that's very courageous. But the implications of the virus in nursing homes for people who don't have it is very significant. Their life has become topsy-turvy. And if I can make my little contribution there, then it gives me meaning in life, and it's easier for me to go on. And in terms of risks, one has to be careful, not reckless, but you can take calculated risks in a manner which you can function fairly well. It's like when you go out on the road, you can always run the risk of having an accident. But if your car's in good shape, and if you put on your seatbelt, and if you drive within the speed limit and you sort of obey the rules, the likelihood of you having an accident is very low. It's not zero, but it's low. It's the same thing in my work now. If I'm careful when I go out, I know what the risks are, where the risks are, then really it doesn't, in reality, it's not as dangerous as it may to somebody like you who isn't doing that sort of thing. That would be my answer. And it gives me tremendous satisfaction, and the families appreciate it. And sure, again, getting is also taking things easy and sometimes getting up late and just watching a movie or whatever, but it's also doing things that are finding the right balance between the two.
We haven't talked about your photography, but we've gone way over. This is the longest interview that I've done, and the time flew by. So Jim, I always ask everybody on my show, and this is something I don't know. What is your favorite Beatles song?
Well, first of all, I like the Beatles.
I know that. Pick a song. Pick a song.
Oh gosh. Maybe Here, There, and Everywhere.
That's my favorite song.
Uh-huh. But I would, if you ask me another day, I might come up with a song.
No, but it is a little bit. We do go back a long way. So Jim, stay. That wasn't the Corona cough. So,
But if you ask me about Simon and Garfunkel, I'll say Scarborough Fair.
okay.
If you ask me about Phil Oakes, I'll say Changes.
Okay. So, yeah, we didn't talk about so many things. So I'll have to have you back in about 2 months, and we'll talk about the music in our lives. The time we went to see Simon and Garfunkel in the Capitol Theater in 1968. I don't know if you remember that.
I lost you. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, I said the time we went to see Simon and Garfunkel at the Capitol Theater in Ottawa in 1968.
I remember that. That was
So,
before they were very famous. That was just as they were moving up on the ladder. It made an indelible imprint on my mind. There's no doubt.
Mine too. So Jim, this has been.
We went to see them at the back. Do you remember?
No,
we went to see them
you told me that,
and we saw them in the changing room.
Yeah, but that I don't remember.
Okay.
I remember the performance. I remember that they sang "Red Rubber Ball," that I didn't know that Paul Simon co-wrote. And somewhere I think I have the playlist. I found it on the internet. I think that the Capitol Theater was demolished, but our memories certainly are not. I'll just say one more thing about how important your family was in my life. Your mom and your dad. The last year of your dad, he was not in good shape. And we went up north to see him. And he said to me, Melech, which was the name that I went by as a young kid. He said to me something like, you turned out all right, kid. And I will never forget that. How important it was for me to make your parents proud of me. Not only my parents, but your parents. So, Jim, this has been incredible. Stay healthy. Stay the way you are, full of activities.
I ran 8 kilometers today.
Why only 8?
Because that's what the group runs.
I was expecting you to run 16. So stay healthy, stay active, and maybe in about 2 months we'll have you back on the show, because certainly I've never had such a pre-audience of people saying, "Oh, Jim Shalom, Jim Shalom." So you've had Mel for 68 years, and you'll always have me. Thank you very much, Dr. Jim Shalom.
Okay, well, for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.